Welcome everyone to another episode of the Shaman's Way podcast. As always, this episode comes from the teachings of our amazing friend and shaman in residence, Kriket. We hope you're enjoying these podcasts as much as we enjoy making them, and I'd like to take just a moment to ask you if you would please leave us a rating and a comment in iTunes or whichever podcast player you're listening to us from. Giving us a rating and sharing this podcast with others is the biggest way you can tell us that you like our show. Now, without further ado, on with the episode.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to our podcast and our time together. I thank you for tuning in and for lending me your incredibly valuable time. Water. I have done, I believe, 3 podcasts specifically on the medicine wheel, some general information, the directions, and another one that I can't remember the title off the top of my head. What I want to move into in this particular podcast is specifically talking about the element of water. When we say the 4 elements, I don't wish to make you think or believe that I only believe there are 4 elements. I think at current or last count, we had well over 130 elements on the periodic table. So I just want to focus on the 4 elements that we use within our medicine wheel. Oftentimes, if you are a witch or a Wicca or a druid, you're going to have a different relationship to the 4 elements. A druid, you're going to have a different relationship to the 4 elements. Some even have the 5th element, which is spirit. So there are different ways to approach this. I don't believe there's a right way or a wrong way. I just want to share with you some of my thoughts and some of my ideas on water. And I may repeat a couple of the ideas throughout here because I'm going to try to approach it in another way. I associate water with West, and I associate the goddess Yemaya with the overwhelming mother instinct of water. I have also told the story of Sedna and Skeleton Woman, both who are stories that relate and specifically refer to water in their story. When the story of Skeleton Woman is taking on the dissolution of self or the removal of all of the flesh of self, left only specifically with the skeletal structure, and that rising up of consciousness. Skeleton Woman is hooked on a fisherman's hook and rises the skeletons. He pulls the skeleton woman to the surface of the water. So in that story, one of the interpretations is that the skeleton represents the skeletons of our consciousness, or the aspects of ourself that don't dissolve away in water, much like our hair, our flesh, our muscles, and so on and so forth. When we're dealing with the story Sedna is an Inuit story, and that Inuit story relates to the giver of all things. A story of a young girl who is murdered by her father, depending on which story or which version you're reading. And ultimately, she is cast out of the boat. In some stories, the primary aspect of it is that her fingers are cut off because she's hanging on to the side of the boat. So the father cuts off her fingers so she can't hold on to the boat, and she floats down into the ocean, and then she becomes the mother of all things in the ocean. And the shamans in that tradition, in the northern traditions, who hold Sedna as their goddess that they wish to see, or the spirit of that water, the spirit of that ocean, they go down and they have to brush Sedna's hair, and from her hair she releases the walrus, she releases the seal, she releases the various animals, but she can't comb her own hair because her fingers have been cut off. Depending on where you come from in the world, you would have a different relationship with water. If you have stories in the desert, those stories in relationship to water or what water represents might be very different than the cosmology, the myths, or the stories that come from an island such as the Queen Charlotte Islands or Haida Gwaii or Vancouver Island, even Bermuda. There would be a different relationship between water and the inhabitants of the land or the inhabitants of the land. Just very briefly, it would be somewhat similar, I believe, to the stories regarding the sun. We have stories of Northern European stories of the sun and the goddesses associated with the sun as being of fertility. European stories of the sun and the goddesses associated with the sun as being of fertility, being, very strong, being the ability to grow things, nurture things, and so on and so forth. Where if we go to the Sahara or if we go to places where the sun is deadly, we have very different stories that talk about the beginning of the sun, beginning of the ruthless ruler of the skies. And water in that regard can have a similar relationship to its inhabitants based on what your relationship is with water. Water is fundamental to creating and sustaining life. As a result of this, it is often symbolically regarded as the Great Mother or the prima materia, the universal womb. It's often associated with birthing, with fertility, the feminine, which is yin, connected to the goddess and other mythological female creatures. Water-related spirits and goddesses celebrate the vitality of water as its status as the source of life. Artemis, goddess of the moon, ruler of the tides, is also associated with menstruation. Water spirits, they also express, as I talked about earlier, the dual nature of water. Water sprites are tempters of evil, embodying both water's life-giving and destructive properties, such as the naiads, the nereids, the sirens of Greek mythology. They were envisioned dualistically, emerging as either shy nymphs or dangerous, luring creatures. Like water's mutable scientific is variable, water is the source of all life when we consider that the amniotic fluid is the water of life. There are even some people who support the idea that humans emerged from water. That is why our tears are, such a high percentage of sea salt, and that when we sweat, we have salt. So there are the evolutionists who believe that humans came out of the water. And it actually is a very fascinating theory, and I've watched a couple of documentaries on it. I don't want to get sidetracked, but it does have some aspects of validity, and it certainly is fascinating to think that we emerged out of the source of all things, the prima materia, out of water. As the source of all life, it also has the power to drown, or paradoxical nature lends to the notion of water, specifically immersion in water, as being a return to the primordial state. So water's manifestations could be rain, which is fertility, springs, the supernatural, vast undifferentiated seas, primordial state, birth, rebirth, the dark depths of the ocean. When we talked about Skeleton Woman, the deep dark depths of the ocean is death, or the shedding of the old. Raging billows and waves, we could refer to this as chaos, power, formlessness, and destruction. When we look at the hurricanes that have battered the southern states, Puerto Rico, Bermuda, along with all of the other islands that I cannot mention because I don't remember the names of all of them, you really see that formlessness, and you certainly see the power of water, the destruction of water. And the relationship I find, well, I'm just going to finish this last thought. Waterfalls. Waterfalls are that place of transition, and in some places, waterfalls are the unification of the feminine and the masculine. So the yin and the yang, the water being that passive and yet have yang energy of falling or going down, the formlessness of femininity and the form of rocks within that masculine. But I wanted to go back briefly with respect to hurricanes. I'm not going to move into the debate of climate change and the warming of the oceans and the number of, catastrophic storms that we've had since the oceans have increased in their temperature has also increase the severity of the storms that we see. I'm not going to move into that because I think we can all make our own decisions on climate change and the effect that the oceans have. However, when we look on the medicine wheel, on the medicine wheel that I use, I have water in the west and air in the east, which are very obviously they're opposite sides of the medicine wheel. But air is that east is that beginning, so it's illumination, where west is water and it's that introspection. So when we have huge storms that have the water and the air coming together in order to effectively destroy the element of earth, I find that as a dance of destruction with respect to the elements. Fire isn't involved in that particular dance, but fire is its own destructive force. It isn't involved in that particular dance, but fire is its own destructive force. It is its own chaos. It is its own destruction. It is also its own form of rebirth. The storms that we have really bespeak that shedding of the old, the undifferentiation between what is right and what is wrong from a human perspective. And from a human perspective, it's wrong that people lose their houses and their entire life and their livelihood based on the strength of water. However, when we look at the other side of water, coming from Canada, the Pacific coast and the Atlantic coast have long held traditions of fishermen or fisherwomen. And here we have that relationship of water as being a life giver for fish. We also have it as being the place of the supernatural. Where do we have those stories of sirens? Where do we have the stories of mermaids? Where do we have that liminal place except in the cultures that have lived on the water? There are even tribes that never come out of the water, who live on the water their entire lives. And their ability to move in the element of water, to free dive in water, to not take a breath underwater for more minutes than you and I could possibly do, the ability to walk on the bottom of the ocean, to have that relationship between your solid form body and the formlessness of water, and the gravity of your body and the buoyancy of water. I think that's incredibly amazing and fascinating to me. I have not really studied how that occurs. I haven't studied that. I just have found that very fascinating. And when we come back to living on the water, we're coming back into that primordial state. Water representing that primordial state, that death of the old and rebirth of the new. In G.E. Carlot, C-I-R-L-O-T, in that book called The Dictionary of Symbols, Carlot describes water on the cosmic level. Quote, on the cosmic level, the equivalent of immersion is the flood, which causes all forms to dissolve and return to a fluid state, thus liberating the elements which will later become recombined in new cosmic patterns. End quote. and wine, it amplifies the element's dual nature, indicating the mingling of water, so the passive and the feminine, and fire being the active and the masculine, and of human and of divine. And also the sharing of wine is that symbol of blood, that symbol of sharing that which heats us. So in older traditions, when somebody would come into your house, you would offer them alcohol, and you would drink of that alcohol, making you brothers and sisters, because you are sharing that which ignites the body, that which fires the body. So as I drink wine, my body is affected. As you drink the same water, your body is affected. So we are brothers and sisters in sharing the blood of the water, in sharing the fire of the water. So we come together as equals in that sense. That's part of the tradition of sharing of waters of life and death. So traversing a waterway can symbolize crossing over from life to death. When we look at the Temiskaming or the West Coast tribes, oftentimes they indicate that someone has crossed the water, meaning someone has gone to the other side. In Egypt, it was customary to bring the deceased pharaoh across the Nile River to the west to a ritual crossing over into the afterworld. When we look at the Greek underworld, the ferryman known as Charon, carried souls over the river Styx into the realm of the dead. When I do soul retrieval work and when I am going into the land of the dead, I often move on a boat that carries me from one shore into a boat that carries me from one shore into across the small river into the land of the dead. And in order to return back to the land of the lower world, the underworld, then I have to cross back over on that particular boat. When we do spirit canoes, the spirit canoe comes from the traditions of the Polynesians, the West Coast natives, where the boat is symbolic of carrying someone from one field or one threshold and crossing it over into another threshold. We also have there are lyrics from the Christian mythology or Christian hymns, and they talk about the River Jordan. And the River Jordan is where the Christ or the Jesus was said to have baptized. Life and the abundant place from which all originate and wish to return, the heaven or that ethereal home. Water is also that liminal place. I talk about this in the discussion of seal skin, soul skin, where I talk about the water being that place between, that liminal place. So we have air, we have life, we can breathe at that place where the water meets the bottom of our nostrils. And once we lower our bodies down into the water, we're going down into that unconscious self. We're going down into that deep river, that divide between the earthly life and this life. In analytical psychology, water is primarily a symbol of the feminine. This could be, we could say that this comes from water's fluid quality. So it's portraying the dynamic fluid, comes from water's fluid quality. So it's portraying the dynamic fluid female side of the personality. For many psychological and spiritual traditions, it represents the power of the unconscious and the deeper layers of the psyche. So dreams, birth is often depicted using watery image. When I call in my prayers for the directions, the prayer that I have for West is from the tiny brooks that roll into the tiny streams, and from the tiny streams which pour into the rivers, and the rivers into the oceans be my emotions. And I refer to the depth of water. That water springs from the rocks, so it is that it is that mystical place. Water, streams come from that mystical place, or that bubbling brook. And it goes from another larger water stream into another larger water stream until it comes right back to its source, or quote unquote, the source, being that prima materia, that water, that element of West. So there we get all of our daydreams. We get the mystical creatures on my medicine wheel live in the West. So that is where we would have our mermaids. That is where we would have our mystical creatures, such as the Cyclops could be a mythological creature you put in the West. The mermaids and the mermen are creatures that we put in the West. There are those aspects. Dreams is in the West. Old age is in the West. So that time, that coming of full consciousness. So on the eastern part, air on the medicine wheel, we come into life. We are born in the medicine wheel. South is where we have those relationships, those conflicts, that building up of. We move west on the medicine wheel and we are coming into old age. So where we gathered knowledge and information we gathered in the east, and knowledge we gathered in the south. And if we're smart and if we're moving in a right way and we're walking on the right path, when we get to west, we come to see that part of illumination. We come to see that illumination has become introspection. So the deepest of the psyche, the deepest of the unconscious self. When I do ceremony, when I do lead a workshop, or when I lead a circle, I talk about the West as being that place of deep vision. So when I call in the West, I call in that opportunity to learn from our unconscious self. If we're dealing with emotional things, then I set out an extra prayer to West. May you bring us what we need to see. May you allow us to dive. Then I set out an extra prayer to West. May you bring us what we need to see. May you allow us to dive deeply into the unconscious and unknown aspects of ourselves, so that we may return to the surface of ourselves enlightened and have a better understanding of where we're going. Just as an example of what we could say. In human spirituality, we all, as we talked about earlier, as water being the primary symbol of the water, or the symbol of the feminine, the cold, moist properties of water symbolize the enclosing or the generating forces of the womb. So intuition and the unconscious mind. In addition, by the way of color, so that blue or that color of light, electricity in the oceans, that conscious awareness spirals and cultivates the feminine intuitive, that creative part of the brain. Some of the historical alchemical or the alchemy or the magical symbol of that inverted triangle symbolizes the downward gravitational flow of water, and the cup or the chalice when we do tarot reading, or when we have witch or Wiccan ceremonies where they drink of the chalice, it is still symbolic of the water triangle, parallel to the ancient feminine symbolism of a downward pointing triangle representation of the female genitalia. As a lesbian, I know that that downward inverted triangle symbolizing, the feminine, or symbolizing the lesbian with the, the pride colors and that. So the feminine elements of intuition, gestation, psychic ability, and the subconsciously, respectively. The cup also stands as a symbol of the goddess, or the womb, and the female generative. Archaeologists have found is that one of the earliest symbols of water is the zigzag. They can trace that back to the Neanderthals, so around 40,000 BC. And Maria Gimbatas, who I have spoke about before, her hypothesis is the letter M is a symbol interpreted as shorthand for the zigzag. It's found on water containers. The chevron, the repetitive form of the V, is often found along with the meander, which is also a water symbol. On the other hand, the meander was a symbol of the great mother goddess and her life-giving and nourishing aspects. It was from the water, the divine waters of the mother's womb, that life came into existence. Some of the earliest depictions of the goddess show her as a hybrid woman and water bird. And if we see many show her as a hybrid woman and water bird, and if we see some of the more prevalent photographs or Temiskaming, the Tlingit peoples, who their shamans' rattles often associated with water creatures, often associated with the ability to shape-shift into a water bird, is also an aspect of the mythology. Without water, life cannot be sustained, and for ancient people, waterfowl were an important source of food. Consequently, water is an archetype from where all life flows. So again, Gimbutas claims it to be a representative of the mother goddess as a life giver. The ancient Egyptians, they also used the horizontal zigzagged bodies of water, such as a lake or a pool or the ocean, by placing the zigzag line in a vertical position and then multiplying it with an equally spaced pattern. The significance is that the ancient Egyptian name for water was Uat, which also meant the color green, and for ancient Egyptians characterized the hard green stone, the emerald, and the green feldspar. This is associated with water, with Aphrodite, with Venus, a sea divinity who is born from the sea as Venus and Aphrodite. Some early Greek thinkers, they conceived of the sea divinities as feminine primordial powers, since the goddess of the sea took part in the creation of the world due to an old belief in which life began in the water. I really do have a strong association with that liminal place. I really have a lot of respect for the West. If I'm dealing with the time of summer solstice, or if I'm dealing with a time when we really wish to honor that part of the medicine wheel. So if we're coming from summer solstice to autumnal equinox, during that point of south to west on the medicine wheel, when I build my altars or when I have my ceremony, I'm going to place more and more emphasis on the unknown creatures of the West, or the creatures of the fairies or the fairy world, the little people. Those creatures, those beings, those spirits all have a very significant role for me in my representations. All have a very significant role for me in my representation of spirit. I've talked a bit about the love that I have for shells, and when I build a medicine wheel, oftentimes I will use shells in place of the stones to represent the moons, because moons are so very associated with water and with lunar tides. I wanted to also talk about, very briefly, one of the stories that I told was the Frog Prince, and talked about Carl Jung and Joseph Campbell, specifically Joseph Campbell, talking about the well as being that place between the conscious and the unconscious. And for a good period of time, my fire pit in the would sometimes change into a well, and I would dive into that well to come from the middle world down into the lower world or into the ocean world. When I spent many years west on the medicine wheel, I had many places. I would have to travel through very deep, very cold, and very black waters of the ocean in order to move into the spirit world of the person that I was working with. So if I was doing a soul retrieval for you, then what I would do is, if, on the west of the medicine wheel, is I would either dive into the well that I had, or over time, what happened in my anchor spot was that the ocean moved into my anchor spot. So I would walk past small fire and head off into the ocean, dive deep into the ocean. And let's say you were my patient, I would move through the ocean, dive far down, go however far east or west I had to go to come to a underground cave that is in the water. And from that cave, I would climb up or down, depending on where I had to find your soul piece. And that would often be how I would get into someone else's spirit world. Water would be my threshold. Water is a threshold place. If we look at just even moving through a waterfall into a cave, or the number of times that we have seen in movies, or 10 places you would love to see in your lifetime. How many of us have been lured by those amazing photographs of the caves that have the waterfall hiding them? I don't know how those caves are formed or how the water got to be there. Again, it's a mystery, and it was seen as a mystery. It was seen as something amazingly spiritual and supernatural when water would spring out of a stone. We even have a reference to that in the Old Testament, where Moses is taking his people across the desert, and the people were very thirsty and required of water. And so Moses took his staff and struck the boulder, and there was water, which personally I think is a story of a diviner. I think that, I think the Bible is making a reference to water diviners and using your stick. So it would be a willow stick or whatever he would use. I don't know what someone in the desert would use, but as a means of divining or finding water. So water is also an element that is influenced, or we can have influence over something else. So if we use our L rods or our pendulum to find water, it has that energy signature. It has that ability, that energy for our pendulum or our L rods or the willow stick we're using for us in order to find it. I have spoken quite a bit, and I don't know if I've gotten a lot of information out there for you with respect to what water is. But to summarize very deeply, or very briefly, water is one of those elements that takes me to the deepest levels and deepest aspects of my own self. Medicine of water, the medicine of cleansing and clearing, the medicine of changing yourself from one transitional state into another. When the story that I've recorded, the necklace, the woman dives deep into the water and she threw away her necklace, and the water invites her to jump in. And so she goes through this amazing transformational process in the water. And Sealskin, Soulskin talks about that a lot, and I encourage you to listen to those two stories if you would like to have a little bit more information on two different aspects of water mythology, because the necklace has a different relationship of water than, say, Sealskin, Soulskin, because that refers to the mythical being, that seal woman coming into human world, and then the woman coming into human world, and then dying in the human world because she doesn't have access to water. It would be like us dying if we don't have access to our unconscious self, if we don't have access to the deep part of ourself, if we don't have access to our dreams, if we deny those water aspects of ourself. We often deny ourselves some of the richest parts of our journey from that world into this world, from this place into that place, because water is a carrier. Water is a life giver. Think about how many days can you go without drinking water before you die? I think it is 4. Some of us go a day and we think that we're dying without water. It is one of those 4 primary elements. When I say prayers and I'm working on healing, I ask the winds of east to and to uncover that which needs to change. And I ask my brother fire to burn through the deadfall and burn through the bushes that requires everything to change. And then I ask the water to move in where the wind has blown the fire and the fire has burned away the deadfall, and to clean away the debris of the body and to moisten the soil of the soul so that new things can come to plant. And then I ask earth to move into the body and encourage growth where growth needs to come, and rest the soil where the soul needs to have rest. So even within my healing prayers, water plays a very integral part of the healing, just by removing those aspects of ourself that in the healing process we've decided to let go of. In the healing process, we've the things that we don't need, and so fire comes along and eats and burns away, that aspect of ourselves that we wish to let go of, and water tempers those flames, brings those flames down, and as a good tide or as a good stream or as a good river, it takes the debris away from the human body and into that ever-growing, that ever-changing womb of consciousness and subconscious and the unconscious self. So I've given you a little bit of food for thought, and I certainly look forward to any type of comments or feedback that you do have. I really enjoy hearing from you, my constant listener, and I would just love to express my gratitude for listening and for sharing your thoughts. And even if you don't share your thoughts, thank you just for listening. And if you find this past and you want to give us a positive rating, that's super. And if you want to share with people that you found this particular podcast, please do so. I am forever in your debt and forever grateful. Have a pleasant whatever the rest of your day is. Until the next time we meet, fare thee well.
Thank you again for joining us here on the Shaman's Way podcast. If you have any questions, would like to make a request for a future episode, or if you're looking for other shamanic resources, including free drumming tracks, please visit us at shamansway.net. Until the next episode, be well, everyone.